the trauma-informed and equitable data collection training put together by Abt and Cal-ICH for California AB 977 grantees. The purpose of this training is to help service providers engage with clients, including collecting HMIS data elements, using a trauma-informed and equitable approach. This training will cover what trauma is, how trauma presents internally and externally, what a trauma-informed and equitable approach is. We will discuss the HMIS data elements that might be particularly sensitive for clients, and how you can apply a trauma-informed and equitable approach to HMIS data collection. This training is intended for service provider organizations, both the providers doing direct data collection as well as the managers and leadership of the organization. Implementing trauma-informed and equitable practices requires a culture shift at both the individual and system levels. This training might elicit thoughts, feelings, or memories that could be uncomfortable or triggering. We recommend that staff are allowed to watch this training individually so they can stop and start it at any point. If watching this training in a group setting, we recommend that staff have the freedom to leave the training at any time or have the option to view the training individually at another time. The transcript and slides can also be printed out to accommodate different learning styles and allow staff to engage with the material in the way that is most comfortable for them. Before we begin, I'd like everyone to take a moment and think to themselves about what headspace you're coming into this training with. It could be related to this training or to things going on at work right now or in your personal life. Think about 1 to 3 words that would describe this headspace. Now I'd like you to think about where you're feeling those emotions in your body. Does your brain feel sluggish? Is your heart rate faster than normal? Do you feel tension anywhere in your body? I'd like you to keep track of these emotional and physical feelings as we go through the training. They will be your indicator to whether you may need to stop the training and continue at another time. Or you might not feel distressed at all during this training, and that's okay too, but you still might learn something about where you're feeling your emotions in your body and how those change over time. So, what do we mean by trauma? Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event or experience. We can think about trauma in terms of individuals and systems. First, we'll talk about traumatic experiences for individuals, which can be single events, multiple events, or consist of long-term or prolonged exposure to distressing experiences on an individual level. One national U.S. study found that 83% of people surveyed had experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes, with many experiencing more than one. Fear and anxiety are normal responses to traumatic experiences. However, most people who experience singular traumatic events will not experience long-term symptoms. What is considered trauma and how an individual responds to trauma varies based on the individual, the type of trauma, and the number of traumatic experiences or length of exposure. What one person experiences as traumatic can look very different from another person. All experiences and responses are valid. Traumatic experiences can be experienced directly or secondhand. A primary example of secondhand trauma is called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is the accruing effect of being exposed to another person's trauma. It has been most notably observed in helping professions where there is close contact with people who have experienced trauma. Vicarious trauma is often experienced on an individual level through repeated or chronic exposure to distressing events through witnessing them, for example, first responders, or hearing about them, for example, therapists or service providers like yourselves. Common examples of trauma that individuals experience include physical assault, either with or without a weapon, sexual assault or other unwanted sexual experiences, emotional abuse, childhood neglect, combat or exposure to a war zone, natural disasters, serious accidents, exposure to toxic substances, captivity, life-threatening illnesses or injuries, and sudden or unexpected loss. This is not an exhaustive list of what can be considered trauma because, as we talked about before, individuals respond to and interpret events differently. Now let's talk about trauma on a systemic level. A systemic trauma framework considers the contextual features of environments and institutions that give rise to trauma, maintain it, and impact post-traumatic responses. Systemic trauma is inherently trauma that impacts more than one person at a time and occurs chronically or over a long-term period of time. Systemic trauma can be instances of community or group level trauma, such as police violence, for example, hypersurveillance, militarization, or police brutality, community violence, such as neglect of public services or food apartheids, policy violence, such as outdated, unjust laws, budget decisions biased in favor of the wealthy, and racism and discrimination. A systemic trauma lens can also be applied to individual traumatic experiences by looking at the context that those experiences occurred in. For example, one example of a single traumatic experience for an individual could be being robbed on the street once. An example of a multiple event traumatic experience on an individual level is that same person being robbed 3 times. Systemic trauma would be multiple people being robbed on the same street over an extended period of time and looking at the systems contributing to the prolonged experience of violence in that community. A systemic framework would ask, what systems are creating this community level trauma? What systems are maintaining the trauma? And what is the impact on the trauma symptoms experienced by individuals in the community on an individual level as well as a community level? Systemic trauma unequally impacts historically marginalized populations. As providers working with individuals and families who have experienced homelessness or housing instability, you are working with people who have experienced at least one individual and systemic trauma, and likely more. As providers, you are at an increased risk of experiencing vicarious trauma in addition to your own individual and/or systemic trauma. Therefore, it is vital that we understand how trauma presents and how we can create trauma-informed and equitable environments for ourselves and our clients. So, what does trauma look like? Trauma symptoms can include a variety of things. The symptoms on this slide are just a handful of symptoms that people experiencing trauma or other stressful events might experience. They can include intrusive memories, such as flashbacks and nightmares, avoiding places or things that remind you of the event, negative changes in thinking and mood, such as feeling hopeless or having negative thoughts about yourself or feeling emotionally numb. Trauma can also include physical and emotional reactions, such as being more easily startled, having trouble sleeping, or having trouble concentrating. Trauma and other stressors can also impact our cognitive self-regulation, which includes the ability to focus and maintain attention, our executive functioning skills, the ability to set goals, attributions and appraisals, which is the meaning we apply to situations, our ability to solve problems, perspective take, and our ability to make decisions. Take a moment to think about how any of these symptoms on the current or previous slide might be present for yourself, your colleagues, or the clients you work with. Imagine how a client experiencing these symptoms might impact their ability to work with you to find housing or engage in services. The symptoms on the previous slides are examples of the effects of trauma in day-to-day life. This slide shows trauma symptoms in the moment when people are feeling triggered or feeling unsafe, regardless of actual danger. When your body starts to feel danger, it enters fight or flight mode, these orange light symptoms in the middle of the slide. That can include a racing heart and difficulty hearing. Once the body enters the freeze or trauma mode, these red light symptoms at the bottom of the slide, the opposite starts to happen and your heart rate slows down. There might be a dissociation or a disconnection from reality. You might feel numb emotionally or physically, or feel drained of energy. Vicarious trauma symptoms can mirror the previously mentioned symptoms. However, there are some symptoms unique to vicarious trauma that include things like thinking about the traumatic event outside of the work setting, becoming overly emotionally involved with a client, or over-identifying with a client. So what can you do if you or a client is feeling triggered? If you or client are experiencing trauma trigger symptoms, especially those orange symptoms on the previous slide, or having any feelings of anxiety, stress, or anger where emotions are heightened, grounding techniques can be a great way to bring that emotionality down by helping you or your client focus on the present moment. Grounding techniques can be anything that gets your brain focusing on the here and now. This can include breathing exercises, thought exercises, or physical exercises. You can find endless lists of ideas by searching grounding techniques, and I have just included a couple here that show a breathing exercise, a physical exercise, and a sensory exercise. Now we're going to talk about what a trauma-informed and equitable approach is. On this slide are the CDC's 6 guiding principles for trauma-informed approaches. The first principle is safety, which includes physical, emotional, and psychological safety. The other principles are trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. Implementing trauma-informed approaches is not about creating checklists, but about a transformation of perspective and an ongoing commitment to place all individuals' safety and individually identified needs at the forefront. It is not meant to be easy or come naturally, and the goal is not to be able to anticipate everyone's needs. The goals of a trauma-informed workplace and service delivery system is for the individuals in charge of the system to create an environment that embodies these 6 principles. Implementing these 6 principles could include changing policies and practices, but it must also be accompanied by a change in mindset. Individuals at every level of the system creating space for all individuals, both staff and clients, to feel safe and supported when identifying their needs. A trauma-informed approach believes in the agency of all individuals and that each person is the expert on what they need. It also acknowledges a history of systems that have been designed to oppress, including housing and homelessness systems. Engaging with systems such as housing and homelessness service providers can be re-traumatizing and invasive, often requiring individuals to provide a lot of details about their lives that can be very distressing. Using a trauma-informed and equitable approach centers the shared humanity of the provider and staff member that can reduce harm when collecting data and providing services to clients. Next, we will talk about how to apply this trauma-informed and equitable approach to HMIS data collection. First, we'll start with a background on the HMIS data elements that might be most sensitive to clients. HMIS data is collected to better understand how people of different races, ethnicities, gender identities, and with different backgrounds experience homelessness and navigate the homelessness response system. However, the process of collecting this information could potentially re-traumatize people being served by the homelessness system. Any data related to a person's experience with homelessness could potentially be traumatic, including but not limited to HMIS universal and common data elements and other identities discussed or implied during data collection. I'll talk about the universal and common data elements on the next slide, but it is important to note that many sensitive subjects can come up during the process of collecting data that may or may not be specific HUD or program-defined data elements and might not even be necessary to enter into HMIS. However, it is still important to treat that information as sensitive and use the practices we'll talk about in just a minute. Out of the HMIS universal and common data elements, these are the ones we anticipate might be the most sensitive for clients. They include race and ethnicity, gender, prior living situation, including length of time homeless and start of homelessness, experiences of domestic violence, and health information, including disabling condition, physical disability, developmental disability, chronic health condition, and HIV/AIDS. It is possible that some clients won't become distressed or re-traumatized by any of these topics, and that's fine too. It's also possible that clients might become distressed by a data element or topic not identified by this training, and that's also okay, since we know that people experience and interpret things differently. Hopefully, the information ideas in this training will help you create a safe environment for your colleagues and clients, no matter what the topic is. So how do you use the 6 CDC principles to engage with clients and collect HMIS data? The following are examples of how to embody the 6 principles of trauma-informed and equitable care. These examples are by no means exhaustive or prescriptive and should be interpreted and expanded on in ways that make sense for your staff and clients. They should also be adapted to the various roles that members of the system hold. For example, senior leadership and supervisors should think about what is within their realm of influence to change at a system or policy level, and how they can better support and supervise staff. Direct service providers should think about how they can support their peers, engage with clients, and collect and enter data. Staff managing HMIS systems should think about how they can design the system and train staff to best protect client confidentiality. These principles and examples are meant to refocus our attention on the humanity of ourselves, our colleagues, and the people we serve. We recognize that it can often feel difficult to balance data quality with trauma-informed and equitable data collection. We hope that through these examples and a shift in perspective to how we think about and engage with people who have experienced trauma, that these two things will not feel at odds with each other, but actually move towards better interactions and relationships between providers and clients that leads to improved data quality and service provision. If people feel safe and supported, they are more likely to be open about who they are and what their needs are, which will help providers collect needed data and, more importantly, increase the likelihood that providers, organizations, and the homeless service system as a whole is able to provide the services clients need. The next few slides offer examples on how to implement each CDC principle for staff and clients. This first one on prioritizing safety on a physical, psychological, and emotional level encourages staff to create a safe environment that celebrates the unique intersection of identities that staff bring with them into the workplace. Remembering that some identities cannot be externally seen, but that does not mean that they are not just as important. Refraining from using us and them language helps in a staff setting because you never know what identities are in the room, and this language can contribute to staff feeling unsafe or unable to be who they are. Staff working with clients can implement safety by limiting data collection to only what is needed at that time. Recognizing when it might not be physically, psychologically, or emotionally safe to collect certain pieces of data, and focus on building rapport and collecting any needed data points at a later time. Staff can make sure to collect data and conduct conversations with clients in safe and confidential locations. It is important for staff and organizations to have strong confidentiality policies and practices. Confidential information, including personal identifiable information, PII, shared by survivors with a housing provider, if disclosed, can mean the difference between safety and danger. It is important for organizations to know the federal, state, and local laws protecting information shared by survivors from disclosure. These protections help minimize trauma and risk to survivor safety while increasing survivor housing stability. Organizations can connect to partner organizations to help with things like safety planning and working with survivors. Staff can also help create safety in their conversations and relationships with clients by saying things like, "Thank you for sharing your story with me. That must have taken a lot of courage. I'm here to support you, judgment-free." We will talk about this judgment-free environment more as we go through the rest of these examples. And this last one for safety is that remember that clients take cues from you about the safety and appropriateness of certain topics. So if you ask a question uncomfortably, it makes the client think that they should be uncomfortable too. One example of this is gender and experiences of domestic violence. So for example, asking about gender and explaining gender options neutrally or positively tells the client that it is okay to hold any of those gender identities. By not assuming a client's gender identity and being open to explaining the gender identity options to clients if they are confused, you normalize all identities and responses to the question. You also create a judgment-free zone that might indicate to the client that you are a safe person to tell other, quote, unspeakable things to. As I mentioned before, this might improve the accuracy of the data you're collecting, but more importantly, it will hopefully better connect clients with services. Some examples of how to demonstrate trustworthiness and transparency in processes and in relationships, including naming and addressing power and oppression, can look like staff reflecting on the power of their various identities and how that compares to peers and the people making decisions in your organization. For clients, it can involve staff protecting client confidentiality. It can include staff following up and following through on requests made by clients, especially including when the answer is no or I don't know. It can involve staff validating the injustice of the violence that clients experience or any other form of oppression. It can also involve staff challenging the use of coded language when they talk directly to clients or about clients with other staff, including words such as non-compliant or resistant. It can also include staff being honest with clients about their rights and options, about what to share and how much information they should or are required to share, and how what they share may or may not impact housing or services. Staff can ensure that consent is truly informed, meaning that clients fully understand what they are consenting to. And staff can name, not just identify or acknowledge, but verbally name the power differentials in client-provider relationships related to your provider status, as well as other identities that staff might hold that might put them at a position of power over other identities that their clients hold. There are many things that an organization can do to build a culture of self and collective care, as well as develop peer and organizational support. Some things that staff can do individually are prioritize your own self-care and that of your colleagues. Staff can be aware of the signs of secondary and vicarious trauma, like we've talked about today, as well as issues of implicit bias and other stressors. Supervisors can support their staff in culturally appropriate and trauma-informed ways to build that self and collective care. Additionally, organizations can reduce the effects of vicarious trauma and burnout at a systemic level through increased vacation and sick leave policies, smaller caseloads for staff, and democratic supervision. Staff can help create this culture of self and collective care for their clients by allowing for client inclusion and equitable participation and examining their own assumptions about clients and possible consequences of those assumptions. Organizations and staff can create space for staff and clients to process stressful national or local events, especially events related to structural racism. Some examples to honor identity and healing and resistance and encourage collaboration and mutuality are for staff to value the perspective that their colleagues bring to their workplace, rooted in their experiences and expertise. Staff and organizations can also create an environment of respect where all staff are encouraged to identify issues and contribute to solutions. Staff can create collaborative environments and identity honoring environments for clients by reflecting on staff's own culture and identities and how these shape interactions with clients who have experienced trauma. For example, how do my understandings and expectations of intimate relationships, respect, and safety impact how am I showing up to this conversation? Staff can consider and ask about a client's culture and the strengths that are rooted in their culture. For example, resiliency, healing, connectedness, and safety. Staff can use reflective statements and questions to clarify understanding of a client's story to make sure that they're not based on staff's own assumptions. And staff can address power differentials in the provider-client relationship through collaborative interactions and co-creating service and housing plans with the client. We have many examples of how to advance equitable participation, empower clients, and center their voice and choice in planning and decision-making. For staff can create equitable ways for staff, particularly those with historically marginalized identities, to participate in staff meetings and decision-making. That could include system or organizational level practices, as well as individual practices in how you show up in meetings. Staff can refrain from tokenizing other staff, or organizations or supervisors can refrain from tokenizing other staff by not expecting them to speak on behalf of all people with a shared identity as them. And then also not expecting staff to teach other staff about aspects of an identity, particularly historically marginalized identities, if that is beyond the scope of their role or outside their professional interests. For clients, staff can empower clients to share what they feel comfortable sharing. People who are safe are able to make better decisions for themselves and engage in the services they need. Staff can check in with clients to confirm that the data they provide is still accurate in neutral and non-judgmental ways. There are a number of reasons why clients' data might be out of date or inaccurate in an HMIS system. Some of these reasons could include an update in status, for example, experiencing domestic violence since the last data collection point, or change in identification, for example, gender identity or sexual orientation. Many identities are fluid and can be impacted by new information or changes in perspective, including things like race or ethnicity. Additionally, some data might not have changed, but a client might not have previously felt safe enough to share a particular identity or life event. So even if clients already have data entered, reviewing the data might be an opportunity for improving data quality if rapport has been built between you and the client since the last data collection point. As always, remember that these questions should be asked in neutral and non-judgmental ways and should only be asked when it is safe for the client to answer them. Staff can also ask clients for their own assessment of the situation and their wishes and needs, centering the client's assessment in decision-making processes. Whenever possible, staff should offer clients more than one option when it comes to housing or services. One way that both staff and clients can be empowered is including staff and clients in feedback loops and decisions regarding policies and practices that impact them. To understand trauma and oppression and their effects through the intersectional lens of cultural, historical, and gender issues, organizations can include staff with varied and intersectional identities in the development and implementation of policies and practices that are responsive to the various identities staff holds. They can also ensure that policies and practices acknowledge the impact of historical trauma. For clients, staff and organizations can develop nuanced forms of support for more marginalized and vulnerable clients, and view client situations from a systems and historical perspective instead of an individual perspective. For example, homelessness as the result of a failed system as opposed to an individual failure. And then staff and clients can recognize how systems perpetuate trauma and mistreat certain groups that they serve, and acknowledge how trauma interlocks with other systems of oppression. As a reminder, this training provides a snapshot of each topic and is intended to provide an overview and a jumping off point for further exploration into how trauma presents and how your workplace and engagement with clients can be more trauma-informed and equitable. Anyone from any background can experience trauma, and it can present itself in many different forms and hold a variety of meanings for each person. There are many ways to create a trauma-informed environment for staff and clients. This training can and should be adapted to local contexts. We encourage organizational leadership to use this training as a starting point for implementing human-centered, trauma-informed, and equitable practices and policies for their staff and clients. We have linked a couple HMIS resources related to person-centered data collection, including HUD's recently developed client-centered data collection approach virtual reality series. These Resources complement this training and can give you additional information or a deeper perspective on some of the topics that we covered here. There are many trauma resources available and many other trainings that can go in depth on certain trauma topics. We have linked here national crisis hotlines, grounding techniques, and the CDC's 6 principles, but we strongly encourage organizations and staff to work with their colleagues and other organizations locally to develop resources that make sense for your organization, clients, staff, and context.